on land, at sea, in the air, and even in outer space. This is the All Our Yesterdays podcast, brought to you by Persistence of Vision Publishing. Hey, and we're back.
What's going on?
We have William Gold with us once again. I'm LBDO.
I'm Lance Feber Myers.
And I'm William Gold.
Yes, William Gold. Look, you barely make a waveform on the little screen.
All right, I'll lean in closer.
There you go, brother. All right. So, Lance, what are we talking about today?
Egypt, right?
Egypt.
We got all the way up to Egypt last time, didn't we? Is that how this goes? Chronologically speaking, Egypt is next.
Egypt is next. In fact, let's recap where we've been so far so we can keep everyone up to speed, so to speak. Do you remember where we started?
The Big Bang, right?
The Big Bang.
The beginning of it all.
Yes. So we discussed the expansion of the universe and the creation of matter and energy, formation of stars and galaxies, nebulae, the supernova and the creation of heavy elements, the creation of the Milky Way, the Earth, life. And then we got all the way to prehistory and talked about that. In the previous episode, we talked about the first civilization, or the first city, which was in Sumer in Mesopotamia, what is now Iraq. And today we are going to move forward a little bit to the most famous, or one of the most famous of all ancient civilizations. Surely we could only be talking about ancient Egypt, the pre-dynastic period, the early dynastic period, and the Old Kingdom. 3 periods. We're going to have the mummies.
Oh, hell yeah.
Oh, hell yeah. We're going to have literal gods. We're going to have literal monsters.
But let me ask you this. Are we going to have camels?
I think it would be a mistake to bring camels into this discussion at this point.
Why is that?
William Gold, will you tell us why there are no camels in this discussion?
Because the Egyptian Old Kingdom and the predecessor culture did not domesticate camels.
There were no camels. Maybe they were wild camels, but that doesn't count for us. Nobody's riding camels.
Where did the camels come from?
We don't know where the camels came from.
I mean, it's not like they hadn't evolved yet.
No, they were camels, but the ancient Egyptians didn't ride around on camels. They didn't have camels. They didn't own camels. They didn't, interface with camels, think about camels, care about camels.
How do we know that? No, there's no hieroglyphics of camels?
There is no hieroglyphics of camels. You're damn right. Listen,
Interesting.
anything that we talk about, particularly from ancient history, but really from any point of history, is going to be a little speculative.
Oh, that's true.
So listen,
That's true.
Was some farmer on the banks of the Nile riding around on a camel and we don't even know about it? Possibly. But we are going to take the position on the All Our Yesterdays podcast today that there are no domesticated camels in ancient Egypt. Ba-boom.
Well, they did have a lot of domesticated animals.
They sure did, didn't they? Didn't they have sheep, William Gold?
Yes, they did.
Did they have goats?
Yes, they did.
Cattle?
Yes.
Did they have pigs?
Yes.
Did they have geese?
Yes, they did.
Okay. We're talking about environmental factors of the pre-dynastic period now. The pre-dynastic period is the period before there are kings in Egypt.
So up in, like, date-wise, what are we talking?
Very, very freaking long time ago. We're talking about 4,000, 5,000 BC.
Okay.
We're talking about as far back as anything going on in Sumer.
Okay.
Okay. There are no cities, so Uruk still has that distinction in Mesopotamia of being the first city, but there's people living in Egypt. They're farming, they're doing their thing. And where are they doing all this? Out in the great open desert? No. They're doing it along the banks of the Nile.
The Nile.
The Nile.
Yes.
And in fact, as we proceed through these ancient civilizations, we're going to find out that virtually all of them were river civilizations.
Sure.
Which is kind of interesting.
That makes sense, though.
It makes sense, but there's water and there's water, right? There's no lake civilizations here.
Oh, yeah.
There's no ocean. I mean, they're coming, but these early major civilizations were in China, in Mesopotamia, in Egypt are river civilizations. So that tells you something. What it tells you, I have no idea. But the life in Egypt, then as now, was defined by the Nile and the cycles of the flooding of the Nile.
Right, right. So that, I guess that would tell you a little bit, right? Is that lakes, while they can flood, I kind of feel like it's going to be a different type of environment, a different type of flooding.
That's probably true.
Yeah, I don't know.
That's probably right.
Certainly something to consider.
The thing about the Nile, though, is it's a very special river. As you know, it is the largest river in the world, longest river in the world. And as I was saying earlier, the people of Egypt did not live throughout what we consider Egypt today. Okay, they lived on a very, very, very narrow strip of land within a few miles of the Nile. And what they found there was a true paradise. Okay, because the Nile flooding creates alluvial soil.
Right. Well, there you go. I mean, that's at least one answer why there'd be river civilization.
Yes.
Right.
Although that's absolutely the case. You're right. I shouldn't say although, except although if we go to Mesopotamia, that's a crappy environment. Okay. In fact, as I look back on our otherwise excellent show about Mesopotamia and Sumer and these places, I really feel like we did sell the audience short on one respect, which is to describe what a true hole Mesopotamia is.
Yeah.
The place is nothing but mud as far as the eye can see. Horizon to horizon.
Like fertile mud at all? Or any,
it's
like
fertile.
Mud?
It's fertile, but there's nothing else there. There are no rocks. There are no plants except what they cultivate in this fertile soil. There is nothing. Everything they built was made out of mud. They would cook these mud bricks.
Yeah.
And build things out of them. And that's why we have very few buildings left from Mesopotamia, because the mud dissolved.
Melted.
Right. And in fact, that's going to come up in this episode because the Egyptians also started out building things out of mud. But let's talk about the founding of two rival nations.
Yeah.
Upper and Lower Egypt, which begins the early dynastic period. Because, why is it the early dynastic period? Because Upper and Lower Egypt each has a pharaoh.
So they established city-states.
They established city-states. They established dynasties. They are ruled by pharaohs in the early dynastic period. And here's the thing that's not confusing at all. Upper Egypt is in the south, and Lower Egypt is in the north.
What?
That's right. That's right.
That doesn't make sense.
Upper Egypt was a narrow strip around the Nile at the south, and the Lower Egypt fanned out around the Nile Delta in the Mediterranean.
Okay, that makes sense then.
And that's why it's Lower Egypt.
That's why it's
Correct.
Lower
Because the
Egypt,
river
this guy
flows
says. The
that way.
river flows down,
South.
downriver.
Flows north.
It flows north.
Flows
so
north.
Downriver.
Oh, flows north. Gotcha.
It flows
Gotcha.
north, so downriver
north.
is,
Yes.
is Lower Egypt.
Gotcha.
All right. That's how important the Nile is. They literally decided to confound everything we know about maps by putting the
Defies gravity. It's going up.
It's a complete inversion of everything that is right and decent about Western civilization.
So these city-states, we discussed, or you informed me last time, right, that one of the things that unifies, right, a city-state or a culture around it, like this, when you become sort of a national entity, is that they speak a certain language.
That's right.
What are they speaking?
They are speaking ancient Egyptian.
Yeah, it's its own thing.
And what do they call their country? Kemet.
Oh, right.
And what does Kemet mean? It means the Black Land.
Interesting.
Why would Egypt be called the Black Land? Because, again, of that alluvial soil.
Sure.
This rich loam that is so productive that it is really not comparable to virtually any other soil on Earth. It is so ideal for the growing of these plants that they raised. So, and when you, as we get into Egypt's history, we're going to discover that there was a lot of tumult, there was a lot of trouble, strife, division, and they stuck with it. Right? They stayed with it. Why? Because they knew what they had was great.
Uh-huh.
They're like, we may be in the middle of the desert, but this is great here. We're going to stick with it. And we're going to put up with having absolute rulers and doing everything they say, etc. So there's trade. They're trading with other civilizations that exist at the time, because, of course, we know that there were others. There was the civilization of the Indus Valley. There was the civilization, as we've already discussed, of Mesopotamia, Sumer and Akkad. There was trade networks with Anatolia, which is modern-day Turkey, early Hittite settlements in Anatolia. They brought in metals from there. They brought in stuff from the Levant, which is now modern-day Syria, Lebanon, Israel, and Jordan. There was Nubia, what is now Sudan, and that was particularly a source of gold, which was very important to the Egyptians, of course. And later on, the Aegean civilization came up, and they were possibly aware of those Aegean civilizations.
Now, so they had their own language. I think we touched on this a little bit. I want to make sure I'm clear that, okay, so they can have their own language, but they can, didn't they, you told me they use cuneiform as well.
No, not Egypt.
Not Egypt.
No, Akkad used cuneiform from Sumer. Assyria used cuneiform from Sumer. Babylon,
that's the one I'm thinking.
Cuneiform.
Yeah. Okay. So no cuneiform here.
No cuneiform here. And remember, we think of this part of the world as being pretty grouped together, but we're still talking about vast distances here.
Okay.
And not over easy terrain.
Yeah.
But over harsh deserts.
So what did they use, if not cuneiform? Is it, I mean, are we talking already hieroglyphic times, or are we like, yeah?
I believe we are talking about hieroglyphics. There may have been stages of the development of hieroglyphics, but I believe that that's the written language throughout the history of Egypt.
Interesting.
Narmer is the first great pharaoh who unifies Upper and Lower Egypt, and his reign begins at around 3273 BC. So that date is contemporaneous with Sumer and its height. Okay. You remember that Uruk is founded in 4000 BC. It isn't destroyed by Sargon until about 2000 BC. So right now, this great pharaoh who unifies Egypt is sharing the world stage, as it were, with the kings of Mesopotamia.
Gotcha.
And there is a piece of archaeological evidence known as the Narmer Palette that you should be aware of, Lance Fever.
Okay. School me.
And I'll tell you why. It is believed to tell the story of the unification of Egypt.
In hieroglyphics.
By this guy Narmer. Well, that's what's interesting, is that we don't know whether there were already hieroglyphics, but it does appear that Egyptian writing only came about following the exposure to Egyptians of cuneiform by Sumerian traders of the Nile Delta. So even though the Egyptians do not use cuneiform, they are inspired by it.
Interesting.
Yes.
We got to come up with one of our own.
Yeah, they're like, look at this. These guys have their writing, and we don't have our writing, and they're the first city. They're great. We got to be great.
Yeah.
Let's have our own writing, and we're going to call it hieroglyphics. And yes, with this great unification.
Did they call it hieroglyphics? Did they call it hieroglyphics?
I don't know if they called it hieroglyphics. It sounds very Greek to me, doesn't it? It's amazing, and this is a little mini tangent, but it is amazing how important the ancient Greeks are to our understanding of all this stuff.
Yeah.
That the ancient Greeks gave the name Mesopotamia to Mesopotamia.
Yeah.
They gave the names the Tigris and Euphrates to those rivers. The word hieroglyphics
Yeah.
almost certainly is a Greek word. So it shows to show you that the Greeks are already
The historians.
they're the historians. Yes. I mean, we have history of a sort in Egypt as far as a discipline, but it is very, very different from what we would respect as serious history today. And I'll tell you why. It is because the history written by the ancient Egyptians, just as the history in Mesopotamia, was propaganda.
Hmm.
It was all about how great the Egyptians were.
Sure.
It was all about how powerful they were. They never lost a battle. They never had any troubles if you look at their written records. So it's really with Herodotus and Thucydides later on in Greece that we get people going, you know what, we ought to try to keep an objective record here.
Hmm. It really puts it in perspective too, though, when you consider how, yeah, if you were an ancient Greek looking backwards, how long ago we're really talking.
Yeah.
You know, this like almost 3,000 years before the Egyptians. I mean, the Greeks, rather.
Before the Greeks that we think of when we think of the ancient Greeks, who lived in about 700, 600, 500 BC.
Yeah.
So thousands of years later. Herodotus himself lives in the 5th century BC. This is 3,500 years.
Yeah, right. So we're closer to the ancient Greeks in time than the ancient Greeks were to what we're talking about now.
Absolutely right.
Yeah.
Absolutely right. And one of the marks of that is the antiquity of the pyramids, which we'll get to very, very shortly. The establishment of the Old Kingdom occurred in around 2613. In the capital city is Memphis. So, Elvis. And there's a great pharaoh of the first dynasty, Djoser, or a Zoser. A great pharaoh because he's the first to build a pyramid. And let's face it, pyramids are the sine qua non of Egypt, right?
Say that again.
We can't even think of Egypt without pyramids. It doesn't even make sense to us. It's like Paris without the Eiffel Tower. Give me a break. I mean, technically, yeah, there was a Paris before the Eiffel Tower, but please, what did people do there? They walked around going, is there something missing? Or
Where are we?
Yeah, where are we? This is such a beautiful city, Paris, and yet there's something clearly missing. Okay, so who built Djoser's Great Pyramid?
Aliens.
Some say it was aliens. And we can discuss later why this idea persists.
Was it aliens, LB?
I believe that it was not aliens. I'm going to go way out on a limb here and say that human beings built these first pyramid. And it was a specific human being who was really responsible for it. A man who is considered one of the first, if not the first, personalities of history. The person whom we know just a little bit about, okay, which is quite rare in early ancient history. His name is Imhotep.
Yes.
Okay? He is history's first genius, perhaps. He is a common man. He is not a noble or royal personage of Egypt. He became a polymathic Renaissance man. Then he became a god. And then he became a monster. All right? He rose under Djoser. He designed the step pyramid at Saqqara. It was the first major Egyptian pyramid and remains Egypt's oldest stone monument, if not the oldest stone monument in the world. He was a priest, a scholar, and an administrator. He was a high priest of Heliopolis. He was the chief architect and head of the royal scribes to Djoser. He was the only non-royal ancient, or one of the only non-royal ancient Egyptians to be deified. But when does this happen? 2,000 years after his death. So again, we see this scope of ancient Egypt is so vast that we're still well in the ancient period, 2,000 years after Imhotep dies. He gets created as a god in the Ptolemaic era, the 4th century BCE, for his work in, of all things, medicine.
So he designed the pyramid.
He designed the step pyramid.
Right.
The step pyramid, which was based possibly on an earlier form of ceremonial tomb that would resemble essentially a large box. Okay, it would be like a crypt. Okay, that you could walk around in. We're not talking about it like a sarcophagus. We're talking about a structure. But they were building those for the pharaohs prior to this. Okay.
Yeah.
And the things were pretty square. So people think maybe what Imhotep's innovation was to actually make a smaller one of these on top of each until they had an actual pyramid.
Yeah.
All right. So it looks kind of like a ziggurat. It is stepped in. It is not smooth. It's not angular in that way, but it is definitely a very impressive piece of work. It's nowhere near as big as the Great Pyramid of Giza that we're going to discuss soon, but it is big and it is very impressive. And it is made, again, of stone, which there also isn't that much stone nearby. They had to go and sail that stone down the river. But I think my favorite thing about Imhotep is that he did become a monster. 4,000 years after his death and over 2,000 years after his deification, he was awakened from death by the entrance of an archaeologist in his tomb. This is in 1932 in the film The Mummy. He was so transformed by the centuries and the process of mummification that he looked like Boris Karloff.
I love it. Yes. But so he was. You're saying this, and I have seen the film, so the documentary. I have seen the Boris Karloff documentary of this, but I didn't. So I guess it didn't dawn on me that it was Imhotep.
Imhotep
Really is the mummy.
Is the mummy.
So, but he was not a pharaoh, right?
This is what I'm saying. Imhotep was not a pharaoh. He was a common man.
Was he? But he was buried in.
He was mummified. He was entombed in a fancy tomb. No one knows where. They've never found his tomb. But he was treated like the big shot that he was, even though he wasn't a pharaoh. Because he's a self-made man. You know, he's a guy who started out obscure and became great. As Shakespeare said in Twelfth Night, some are born great, some achieve greatness, some have greatness thrust upon them. Well, Imhotep achieved greatness.
Yeah.
And his name is recorded on the statues of his pharaoh, Djoser. Djoser acknowledged his greatness, and that's probably one of the reasons why he was given this great ceremonial burial, as well as later becoming a god.
Related to this, the pyramids as burial tombs were not strictly for the pharaohs. They were for the pharaohs and servants of the pharaohs, an administrator that worked under the pharaoh, and many others. There was an entire court that would be buried, and sometimes animals buried with them.
It was one of the very kind things that the Egyptians did. They said, we don't want the pharaoh to be lonely.
Yeah, in the afterlife.
We don't want him to have to bear his own cup or slaughter his own animals.
It's not till death do us part.
Right.
With
so
him and his court.
Put in a retinue
Yeah.
of servants and as you said, administrators who will take good care of the pharaoh, and we're going to bury them alive.
So do we know, surely we do, but do you know, LB, the religious beliefs that, I guess were a part of this? So I guess my question would be, if you're not buried in a tomb like this, or if you're not mummified, or if you're not, I mean, does everyone get to enjoy the afterlife? Or does everyone get to go to the afterlife?
Everyone goes to the afterlife and to the underworld,
Mhm.
okay? Well, everyone whose heart weighs less than or equal to a feather. Okay, if your heart is heavy with your
Mm.
sins, you don't get to go. In fact, your heart is devoured by Anubis, I believe. One of these gods.
With the jackal head?
Yeah. That jackal head. I think it's Anubis. Anyway, a god devours your heart
Yeah.
if it's too heavy with sin. But how well you get on in the underworld is going to depend on things like, do you have a retinue of servants who are
Right.
buried
Yeah.
alive with you? And for most of us, I'm afraid,
Yeah.
the answer is no.
We have to go it alone.
Yes. So we're talking about gods, though, of ancient Egypt. You know, there are a lot of those. There are over 1,500
Is that right?
deities in ancient Egypt. And it makes sense because all those different city states and stuff, they're all rocking their own gods. And then you have your sort of overarching gods, you know, and the pharaohs are mostly gods, or they're symbolic of gods. One of the early gods is the creator god, the god of wisdom and patron god of Memphis. His name is Ptah.
Hmm.
All right, he's the master of justice and lord of truth. His powers are associated with the pharaohs, including Mat, which is justice, Hu, which is authority and logic, Sia, intelligence and perception. Okay, so these are remarkable characteristics the Egyptians expressed through their mythology, and I want to thank William Gold in particular for bringing those gods to our attention, because we can slip on our gods sometimes.
Yeah, I think my only exposure to the Egyptian god, I never read anything about him other than what I saw in Deities and Demigods.
Deities and
From,
demigods.
yes, from Dungeons and Dragons from way back when.
That's from our personal histories, right? We grew up playing Dungeons and Dragons.
Absolutely.
And that probably explains why we're now podcasters. Okay.
So speaking of architecture, let's
Yes.
get into the art here, right? This is the part that I've been waiting for. There is a question and a thought that I want to pursue and kind of explore a little bit, and that's, we have a civilization, right, that it lasts for thousands of years. I mean, yes, thousands of years ago, but the civilization itself lasts for thousands of years. And when we think of Egyptian art, there is a very, very particular style that we think of. That in the hieroglyphics, in the giant statues, in the friezes, and all those things that we come to know from our history books.
Mhm.
I think it's kind of interesting to analyze the homogeneity of the style.
Yes.
The fact that it can last for thousands of years. Now, am I perceiving that correctly? Is there a consistent, narrow style throughout this entire civilization?
I think that is a reasonably fair statement. Yes. The classic art style, visual art style,
Yeah.
or I should say painting style of the Egyptians, always in profile,
Yeah.
often in interesting sort of rigid poses.
Yeah.
I believe that is pretty consistent throughout. We are going to see in architecture the influence of other civilizations coming in with the columns and things like that later on. But so we'll get some diversity in that. But that straightforward profile, that iconic look, I think is pretty consistent. It's interesting that you mentioned that too, because Egypt has a reputation for having been a static society,
Right.
for thousands and thousands of years. That
Yeah.
it really didn't change, and that is an oversimplification, to be sure. It's certainly true that its history had ups and downs, tremendous ups and downs. There are periods of darkness, medieval kind of periods, and there were periods of great prosperity and great prestige. But it is also true that yes, the art, the hieroglyphics, these things start very early, and they're saying if it ain't broke, don't fix it.
Well, I
Well,
think
there's, I was going to say, there's something about the way that these pictures were used that may have been a factor. For example, you'll see on that palette of Narmer,
Mm,
Narmer's size depicted in a certain way relative to other figures and other
yes,
other images besides Narmer's palette, but other images that tell stories of this sort will depict a figure larger in terms of dimensions on the art surface, canvas or whatever,
yes,
and that
substantially
that
larger.
represents status.
yeah, yeah,
Yes.
the hieratic scaling
Yeah.
of the figures. Correct. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So there's some meaning behind the particular style of representation.
Yes,
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true, and probably certainly plays a role here. And you mentioned the fact that the Egyptians weren't necessarily always telling the truth about these ups and downs.
right,
That they
right.
wanted to portray themselves as a very stable, very successful
Mm-hmm.
civilization. So that probably plays a role in the sort of propagandizing of any government funded art
Mm-hmm.
would probably need to portray stability. And you can certainly see that in that sort of like that Egyptian gaze of like that sort of staid, like looking out over the horizon, like nothing phases us. You know, we're looking off into the future, and it's we're a stable environment where we're strong and nothing can push us over.
Yes, and it's probably not a coincidence that the advent of the discipline of history with Herodotus and Thucydides and others occurred in a relatively anarchic society
Mm,
of ancient Greece, classical Greece,
yeah, yeah.
where there was no unified government to the entire country, and that these city states would fight each other and were not necessarily friends. In Egypt, they must have known that they were on the best real estate in the world, that life may have been tough at times, but they had it pretty good, and they were pretty happy with their pharaohs and so forth, as we see in things like the construction of the pyramids. So that there's an inherent conservatism in that sort of
Right. Yeah,
outlook.
yeah.
Like, we've got this thing, let's not blow it.
Yeah, yeah.
And an example of that, again, is the building of these pyramids. I grew up being told that the people who built the pyramids were slaves,
Mm.
but it is now believed they were very far from being slaves. They were professional builders who were farmers part time, but had plenty of time when the Nile was flooded during much of the year to do whatever they chose, and they chose to work on these great monumental projects. And they would work in these gangs, and they would take great pride in their gangs. They these work gangs, they would have little slogans: "We're the fastest gang, we're the most precise gang," and so forth. Yeah, so these pyramids are part of much larger burial complexes with perimeter walls, smaller pyramid tombs, courtyards, and temples. And the pyramids were even more impressive to look at back then because they were slightly larger. They've eroded since then. And they were also much, much smoother, much, much shinier. They were covered with white limestone. So we've already discussed Djoser's step pyramid built by Imhotep. That was 204 feet high. Then came the bent pyramid of Snefu, which they were building this pyramid and they realized the mechanics of it were just not working. It was too steep and it was just falling down as they built it. And so they had to adjust the angle of the pyramid to a lower gradient. And so we have this pyramid that looks kind of, well, it's bent. So they call it the bent pyramid. And then we get to the Pyramid of Khufu. That is the Great Pyramid of Giza. And Khufu is regarded as a living god, Horus. And this thing is 480 feet high. So that's really tall.
And when was that one? When are these?
This is the Great Pyramid of Giza, also known as the Pyramid of Khufu.
But date wise.
Oh, date wise, it's about 100 years after the step pyramid was built.
Yeah.
Talking about like 27.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Almost.
2500 BC. Okay. So, yeah, so they build this thing. And we were talking earlier about the Eiffel Tower. When the Eiffel Tower was finished in the late 19th century, it became the tallest building in the world. And it was knocking out the previous tallest building in the world, the Great Pyramid of Giza. Nothing had subsequently been built
Yeah.
as high as this pyramid until the Eiffel Tower. Another way to express the immensity of this object is to talk about Lefty Leibowitz, who one time, he's an old friend of ours, a friend of the show. He and I went to Niagara Falls, and we were looking at the American Falls, and he's shaking his head. And he's like, this is puny. This is not big. He goes, you hear about something like Niagara Falls, you expect it to be big. And he says, you know what is big? The freaking Pyramid of Giza. He said, that is huge. Okay, so I haven't seen the Great Pyramid of Giza. I don't know about you turkeys, but I believe Lefty. This building is,
We'll see.
it is almost as tall as a 50-story building.
I think the show needs to fly us out there just to be sure.
I think that's a great idea. William Gold, see to it.
See to it. Well, I wanted to say this. If you're
Go ahead.
if you have a sense of the size of what an acre is,
Mm-hmm.
this pyramid covered something like 13 acres.
13 acres at the base. Immense. That's 411 by 358 square feet. Oh, no, feet.
Yeah.
And here's another little factoid for you. And it's an example of the sophistication of Egyptian building techniques. The lowest point, altitude-wise, of the base of that pyramid, that's, what is it, 16 acres?
13 acres.
13-acre base of that pyramid is 1 inch below the highest point.
Wait, what? Say that again.
Picture a plane.
Okay.
It is uneven,
Oh, okay.
right? Because it's on the ground.
Mhm.
It's on Earth. It's not a ideal plane.
Yeah.
It has a lowest point,
Mhm.
altitude-wise, and a highest point.
Okay.
There's a 1 inch difference between the lowest point of that base and the highest point.
So they did a damn good job of
It's
leveling
insane.
They must have had a
the
bubble.
foundation.
Yeah, they gotta have had a bubble level. No, but really, it's truly astonishing. And again, I promised the audience we would discuss this a little bit, so let's do it. It's one of the reasons why people think that the aliens came and built this pyramid. Because,
Yeah.
yes, there is an insane level of precision in this engineering. Another thing is, how do you get those rocks up there? Well, a ramp. But there's only two ways to do a ramp. There's a straight ramp, which would have required as much stone as the pyramid itself to build that ramp. Or there's a spiral ramp going up, which is probably what they used. But the thing is, it's very hard to conceive of how that would have worked because getting the stones around the corners would have been so difficult.
Hmm.
And so, I think it's absurd to say that it was aliens. It was probably goblins, right? Or ghouls. No, but it was probably people, but it is phenomenally impressive.
Well, is there, and here we're getting the stuff I don't know anything about, total ignorance. Is there something about its placement having to do with some sort of, geometric perfection of lines, or having to do with like being the center of some sort of landmass, or to go even further into ridiculousness, really would be magnetic fields in the Earth's.
Yes, the answer to your question is yes.
What is that?
The north-south alignment of the Great Pyramid of Giza is perfect. And so if you want to go on YouTube or something and learn about it, they will speculate about possible techniques they might have used in order to establish this perfect north-south alignment for this pyramid, but nobody knows for sure. So again, was it a landing craft or some sort of a signpost for
Yeah.
ancient UFOs? Some people say yes. I say no. But I'm still very impressed.
So, on a different note, maybe a different note, what is the ancient Egyptians' role in the Old Testament?
The ancient Egyptians' role in the Old Testament comes later.
Okay, so next podcast.
Next time we talk about Egypt, it's not going to be the very next episode because we have a lot of different ancient civilizations to touch on.
Okay.
But we will talk about the pharaoh Ramses II, who is mentioned very extensively in the Bible, who, according to the Bible, had magicians who could actually perform miracles, if you remember.
Yep.
As magicians could do things like throw a staff on the ground and have it turn into a snake.
Yeah.
So this guy meant business.
Yeah. Of course, Moses had his snake swallow that snake.
That's right. Moses also performed some pretty sweet magic.
That's right.
But yeah, that's all later.
Yeah.
And really, what we're talking about now with this old kingdom is the time of these great achievements like the pyramids. But the later kingdom era, these later periods will have a lot of really important stuff also. The greatest pharaohs who ever lived, the pharaohs who, the sort of guys like Ramesses who were so amazingly interesting and were so powerful. That's all still ahead of us. So I don't want you to worry, ladies and gentlemen at home, that we're going to be talking about some boring Egypt stuff later and that all the good stuff is here, because it's not. There's more. But speaking of the good stuff, well, what about the fact that these pyramids were largely underground structures?
Yeah.
Okay. There are labyrinthine chambers, mazes underneath these pyramids that are essentially designed with a specific purpose in mind of foiling Indiana Jones. Okay? Like literally, if you see the first Indiana Jones movie, Raiders of the Lost Ark, you see him in that temple. It's in the jungle. It's not an Egyptian thing, but it's very similar. It has dead drops with spikes at the bottom. It has false turns. It has darts shooting out of the walls.
Oh, hell yeah.
This is the kind of crap they put in these pyramid complexes. They would deliberately have misleading twists and turns. They would have where you could kill yourself, not really to foil Indiana Jones, but to foil grave robbers.
Sure.
By the time they built these pyramids, they had been dealing with grave robbers for centuries and centuries. And spoiler alert, it didn't work here.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
All the stuff was stolen from all these pyramids. All the stuff was stolen from all of the later tombs in the Valley of the Kings and elsewhere, except for King Tut. We're not going to talk about King Tut in this episode, but you know it as well as I do. King Tut's tomb was not found by grave robbers. It was found by the archaeologist Carter in the 1930s, I believe, or late 20s. And there was so much gold in there that it still makes your head spin.
Still?
It still does. It was like literally tons of gold. It's the amount of. I mean, Howard Carter. If I had been him, I would have been like, let's become grave robbers.
Right.
But there were also Queen's pyramids. There was the pyramid of Khafre. It's one of the biggest pyramids in the world. Here's a little factoid for you. The largest pyramid in the world is the pyramid of Giza, but the second and third largest pyramids in the world are at Tenochtitlan in Mexico. Now, what about the Sphinx?
What about the Sphinx?
The Sphinx is one of the most famous monumental sculptures in the world, one of the most recognizable statues in the world. It is a lion with the head of a man. It is 240 feet or 73 meters from paw to tail. And the archaeological evidence suggests it was created by the ancient Egyptians in the Old Kingdom that we're discussing now during the reign of Khafre, which is around 2500 to 2500 BC in that time frame. It took about a year, I believe, to build. It was quarried from the same rocks that they used to build the pyramid. So that's a lovely detail. It's a myth that Napoleon's troops shot off the Sphinx's nose. But if you didn't know that myth, what do you care?
Wait, that didn't happen.
It did not happen.
So where's his nose?
There is a theory that I heard that the nose was actually deliberately cut off by early Islamic civilization because they didn't like the fact that the Sphinx was so godlike. They thought it was blasphemous to allow it to.
Gotcha.
They didn't destroy it like ISIS did destroy a lot of stuff in the last 10 years, unfortunately. But they mutilated its face. So the Sphinx has no nose. And that's all good.
The Sphinx.
Mm-hmm.
What is it? What is it for?
What is the Sphinx for? That's a great question. I'm not sure we even know what the Sphinx is for. The interesting thing to me, and it goes again to this theme that we keep repeating of how long a period antiquity or ancient times was, that the ancient Greeks came up with their own idea of who the Sphinx was.
Mm-hmm.
They put the Sphinx in the tragedy of Oedipus, in which the Sphinx is asking a riddle.
Right, the riddle of the Sphinx.
The riddle of the Sphinx. But this had nothing to do with what the Egyptians saw. There's no evidence that the Egyptians saw the Sphinx as a riddle maker.
Right. Yeah.
This is like Johnny-come-lately guys, Sophocles and so forth, coming up with explanations. And if they had known what Sphinx really was, quote unquote, they probably would have written it down. Yeah. But I don't think they knew either.
Yeah. It makes it somehow more alluring. Something really cool about that.
That is the riddle of the Sphinx.
That's the riddle of the Sphinx.
Riddle.
Yeah, that's the true riddle of the Sphinx. Do you remember what the riddle of the Sphinx is in the Oedipus cycle?
What walks on 4 legs, then 2, then 3?
4 legs in the morning.
Oh, correct. Yes, in the morning.
2 legs.
2 legs in at noon, and
3 legs,
3 legs
in the evening. Yes.
Yes.
And Oedipus correctly answers this question. It is a man who is born a crawling baby.
Yes.
Walks as an upright man at noon and has a cane. Yeah.
Too clever, Sphinx.
Too clever, but not clever enough, Sphinx. God, have you ever felt like the Sphinx?
Have I ever felt like him?
Yeah, like where you're like, I thought I was so clever. I thought I was going to stump this guy and eat him.
Have I ever? I don't know that I've ever felt too clever.
It's crazy how much history is out there. And how much of it is just so good.
That's why we're here, isn't it?
Why we're here.
That's why we're here doing
Got
this.
so many yesterdays. And we're going to talk about
We do all of them.